Picture a quiet street in Haarlem, Netherlands, in the spring of 1943. Two teenage girls step out of their modest home, wearing simple dresses, their hair neatly pinned back. They could be anyone's daughters, anyone's sisters. To the Nazi soldiers patrolling the cobblestone streets, they appear harmless, innocent even. Young women heading to work, perhaps stopping by the market, living their lives under occupation like everyone else. But beneath those ordinary exteriors lies something the Third Reich never anticipated. These sisters are not what they seem. They are hunters, and their prey wears swastikas. What the Nazis don't know, what they will never suspect until it's too late, is that these two girls have already killed, and they will kill again. The question that haunted Allied intelligence for decades, the question that went unanswered even after the war ended, was simple yet chilling. Exactly how many German officers fell to their perfectly executed traps? The sisters themselves would take that number to their graves, buried under layers of trauma too deep to excavate, hidden behind a wall of silence that not even their own children could penetrate. Before the darkness descended, before the occupation turned their homeland into a nightmare, the Netherlands was a nation of cyclists and tulips, of cheese markets and windmills. Haarlem, just west of Amsterdam, thrived as a center of culture and commerce. The Oversteegen family lived modestly but comfortably in this city of brick facades and narrow canals. Freddie Oversteegen was born in 1925, her younger sister Truus in 1923. Wait, let me correct that. Truus was actually the older one, born in 1923, while Freddie came 2 years later in 1925. Their mother, Treintje, was a woman of fierce principles, a communist who had already been hiding Jewish refugees in their small apartment before the war even began. She raised her daughters to believe in justice, in standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. The girls grew up attending political meetings, understanding from an early age that the world was not always fair, and that sometimes good people had to do difficult things to protect the innocent. It was a childhood that prepared them, though they didn't know it yet, for the most dangerous work imaginable. Then came May 10th, 1940. The Nazis invaded. The Dutch army, unprepared and overwhelmed, surrendered after just 5 days of fighting. The occupation began with rules, curfews, and ration cards. Jewish neighbors started disappearing. Yellow stars appeared on coats. The SS established headquarters throughout the country. Haarlem, like every Dutch city, fell under the shadow of the swastika. The Oversteegen sisters watched as their Jewish friends were rounded up, as resistance members were executed in public squares, as their country transformed into something unrecognizable. The occupiers moved through the streets with absolute confidence, believing the Dutch people broken, compliant, defeated. They installed collaborators, set up checkpoints, and began the systematic destruction of everything the Netherlands had been. For most families, survival meant keeping your head down following orders, pretending not to see what was happening to your neighbors. But Treintje Oversteegen had raised her daughters differently. She had raised them to fight. The call came in 1941. A commander from the Dutch resistance, a man named Frans van der Wiel, approached their home. He had heard about Treintje's work hiding refugees. He had heard about her daughters, smart and fearless. But what he asked seemed impossible. He needed soldiers for the most dangerous operations. He needed people who could move through Nazi checkpoints without suspicion. He needed killers who looked nothing like killers. Truus was barely 16 years old. Freddie was only 14. They were children, but they were also invisible. The Nazis would never suspect teenage girls of being enemy combatants. They would never see the threat until it was too late. Van der Wiel explained what he needed: sabotage, intelligence gathering, and yes, assassinations. Targeted killings of high-ranking Nazi officers and Dutch collaborators. The work was brutal, the chances of survival slim, the consequences of capture unspeakable. Most adults would have refused. Most parents would have hidden their children away. But Treintje looked at her daughters and asked them a single question. Could they do this? Could they become what the resistance needed them to become? The sisters didn't hesitate. They said yes. Not because they were reckless, not because they didn't understand the stakes. They said yes because their mother had taught them that some things were worth dying for. They said yes because they had watched their Jewish friends dragged from their homes. They said yes because the alternative, doing nothing, accepting the occupation, was a different kind of death. And so, at an age when American teenagers were going to sock hops and football games, Truus and Freddie Overstegen became soldiers. They joined Hannie Schaft, another young woman who would become legendary in the Dutch resistance. Together, these three girls formed one of the most effective and deadly resistance cells in the Netherlands. They were trained in weapons, taught how to shoot accurately, how to escape pursuit, how to kill quickly and efficiently. They learned to flirt, to smile, to use their youth and femininity as weapons. They learned that a Nazi officer would follow a pretty girl into a dark forest without question, never imagining that he was walking toward his own execution. Their first missions were reconnaissance, delivering messages, moving weapons. But it didn't take long before the resistance needed them for something darker. The Nazis were executing resistance members faster than they could be replaced. Collaborators were betraying safe houses. High-ranking officers were coordinating deportations that sent thousands to death camps. Someone had to stop them. Someone had to make them afraid. Someone had to show the occupiers that they were not safe, that they were not invincible, that even in the heart of their own territory death could come for them. And it did. It came on a bicycle, with a pretty smile and red lipstick. It came in the form of two teenage sisters who had decided that if the Nazis wanted war, they would give them war. The kind of war the Third Reich never prepared for. The kind fought in shadows by enemies they never saw coming. The training was fast, brutal, and necessary. Frans van der Wiel didn't have the luxury of time or gentle instruction. He handed Truus and Freddie pistols and taught them how to aim for center mass, how to handle the recoil, how to keep their hands steady when adrenaline flooded their systems. They practiced in basements and abandoned barns, firing into sandbags until the motion became muscle memory. The girls learned to disassemble and reassemble weapons blindfolded, to hide pistols in their coats and purses, to walk through checkpoints with loaded guns pressed against their ribs without flinching. But the hardest lesson wasn't technical. It was psychological. Van der Wiel looked both sisters in the eyes and told them the truth. They would have to kill men face to face, not from a distance, not in the chaos of battle, but up close. Close enough to see their eyes, close enough to hear their last breath. Could they do that? Could they pull the trigger and live with what came after? Truus answered first. She was the older sister, the protector, the one who had always shielded Freddie from the worst of the world. She said yes without hesitation, but her voice carried weight, understanding. She knew what she was agreeing to. Freddie, younger but just as determined, nodded. They would do whatever was necessary. The resistance didn't need soldiers who hesitated. It needed executioners, and that's what the Overstegen sisters became. Their first assignment came in late 1941. A Dutch collaborator had been feeding information to the Gestapo, information that led to the arrest and execution of at least 7 resistance members. He was too well protected for a direct assault, too cautious to be caught off guard, but he was also a man, and men had weaknesses. Truus was given the assignment. She was 17 years old. She put on lipstick, fixed her hair, and cycled to the cafe where the traitor spent his evenings. She smiled at him, flirted, suggested a walk through the nearby woods. He never questioned why a beautiful young woman would be interested in him. His arrogance made him blind. They walked into the forest together, the collaborator talking proudly about his connections, his importance. Truus laughed at his jokes, touched his arm, led him deeper into the trees where the shadows grew thick and the sounds of the city faded. When they reached a clearing far from any witness, she stopped. Her hand moved to the pistol hidden in her coat. The man, finally sensing something wrong, turned to face her. But it was too late. Truus raised the weapon and fired. The shot echoed through the trees, a sound that would replay in her mind for the rest of her life. The man dropped. Truus didn't wait to confirm the kill. She ran, her heart pounding, her hands shaking, the weight of what she had just done crashing down on her with every step. She made it back to her bicycle, pedaled through the streets with tears streaming down her face, and arrived home where her mother held her while she sobbed. She had just killed a man. She was 17 years old, but there was no time for grief, no space for trauma. The war didn't pause for conscience. The next assignment came days later, then another, then another. Freddie executed her first target shortly after her sister, using the same method: charm, isolation, execution. The pattern became routine. The sisters would identify their target, usually a Nazi officer or a particularly dangerous collaborator. They would approach him in public, always together or with Hannie Schaft, always appearing innocent. They would flirt, suggest a private meeting, lead him away from crowds and witnesses. Once isolated, the guns came out. Sometimes the men begged, sometimes they tried to run, it didn't matter. The sisters had learned to disconnect, to see the targets not as human beings but as threats that needed to be eliminated. It was the only way to survive the work, the only way to pull the trigger again and again without completely losing themselves. The Nazis never suspected them. How could they? Truus and Freddie moved through occupied Harlem like ghosts, their youth and femininity the perfect disguise. German soldiers smiled at them at checkpoints, sometimes even flirted. Gestapo officers passed them on the street without a second glance. The sisters used every advantage their age and gender provided, weaponizing the very assumptions the Nazis made about women and girls, and the bodies kept piling up. Officers found dead in forests, in alleyways, in abandoned buildings. The Germans increased patrols, instituted harsher curfews, executed civilians in retaliation. But they couldn't stop what they couldn't see. They couldn't fight an enemy that looked like someone's daughter. The Oversteegen sisters had become exactly what the resistance needed: invisible assassins. And their work was just beginning. The assassinations were only part of their work. Between the killings, the sisters lived double lives that would have broken most adults. By day, they were ordinary Dutch girls, cycling through Harlem with ration cards and forged identification papers, attending the occasional social gathering to maintain appearances, smiling at German soldiers who never imagined the blood on their hands. By night, they became saboteurs and smugglers. They blew up railway lines used to transport Jews to concentration camps, using explosives hidden in their bicycle baskets. They sabotaged Nazi vehicles, pouring sugar into gas tanks, cutting brake lines, ensuring that German convoys broke down in vulnerable locations where other resistance members could attack. They distributed underground newspapers that told the truth about the war, about the death camps, about the resistance victories the Nazi propaganda machine tried to hide. Every mission carried the risk of discovery, of torture, of execution. But the sisters never stopped. Their most dangerous work involved rescuing Jewish children. The Nazis had begun systematically rounding up Jewish families, separating children from parents, sending them to transit camps before the final journey to Auschwitz and Sobibor. The Oversteegen sisters, along with their resistance cell, developed networks to intercept these children before deportation. They would arrive at Jewish homes hours before the Gestapo raids, warned by informants within the Dutch police force. They would take the children, sometimes infants, sometimes teenagers, and move them through a network of safe houses. Truus and Freddie transported these children hidden in crates, in the bottom of carts covered with vegetables, even sedated and hidden beneath their own clothing. They delivered them to Christian families, willing to risk everything to shelter them, to farms in the countryside, to convents where nuns falsified baptismal records. The work required absolute precision. One mistake, one suspicious checkpoint guard, and everyone died. The psychological toll was immense. Freddie later described the constant fear as a living thing, a weight that pressed down on her chest every moment of every day. They couldn't trust anyone outside their immediate cell. Neighbors could be informants, friends could be compromised. Even other resistance members might crack under Gestapo torture and reveal names, locations, plans. The sisters learned to sleep lightly, to always know where the exits were, to carry cyanide capsules in case of capture, because capture meant torture. The Gestapo had refined their methods, and they were particularly brutal with women resistance fighters. The stories of what happened in their interrogation rooms were whispered warnings throughout the underground. Better to die by your own hand than fall into theirs. Truus kept her capsule in a locket around her neck. Freddie kept hers sewn into the hem of her coat. They promised each other that if one was captured, the other would not attempt a rescue. The mission was bigger than any individual life. But despite the fear, despite the exhaustion, despite the nightmares that woke them screaming, they continued. Because stopping meant abandoning the people who depended on them. It meant letting the Nazis win. The resistance network in Harlem grew around the sisters' reputation. Other cells requested their assistance with high-risk operations. They became specialists in eliminations, called in when a target was too dangerous or too well protected for standard operations. A Gestapo captain who had personally tortured resistance members to death. A Dutch SS officer who volunteered for firing squads. A bureaucrat who processed deportation orders with enthusiastic efficiency. The sisters studied their targets, learned their routines, identified their weaknesses, and executed them with cold precision. They didn't keep count. Counting meant remembering each face, each moment, each kill. And remembering in that much detail meant madness. The work changed them in ways they couldn't articulate, wouldn't understand until decades later. Freddie stopped crying after missions. Truce developed a hardness in her eyes that never completely faded, even in peacetime. They had seen too much death, caused too much death, lived too long in a world where survival meant becoming something inhuman. But they also saw moments of extraordinary courage. The mother who handed her infant to Truce, knowing she would likely never see her child again, but trusting that this teenage girl would save her baby's life. The father who thanked Freddie for killing the collaborator who had betrayed his family, even though it meant his own execution was certain. The Jewish families who survived because two sisters decided that some lives were worth risking everything to save. These moments didn't erase the darkness, but they provided purpose. They were the reason the sisters kept loading their weapons, kept cycling into danger, kept pulling triggers even as pieces of their souls died with each shot. By 1943, the Nazi occupation had tightened its grip on the Netherlands like a closing fist. The initial shock of invasion had given way to systematic brutality. The Gestapo had infiltrated resistance networks, turning members through torture or blackmail, unraveling cells that had taken years to build. Public executions became commonplace, bodies left hanging in town squares as warnings. The deportations accelerated. Trains packed with Jewish families left daily for the East, heading toward camps whose true purpose was still hidden behind Nazi lies about resettlement and work programs. The Oversteegen sisters watched their country bleed, watched neighbors disappear, watched collaborators grow rich on seized Jewish property, and they continued their war. But the enemy was learning. The Nazis had finally realized that women were active combatants in the resistance, not just support roles. Security protocols changed. Officers were warned about attractive women approaching them. Patrols increased in areas where assassinations had occurred. The work became exponentially more dangerous. The resistance adapted. If the Nazis expected women to approach targets alone, the sisters would work in pairs or groups. If officers avoided isolated locations, they would strike in more public settings using the chaos of crowds to escape. Truce and Freddie became experts in improvisation, reading situations in real time, adjusting plans on the fly. One operation involved eliminating a high-ranking SS officer who traveled with armed guards and varied his route daily. Standard assassination methods wouldn't work, so the sisters studied him differently, not his security protocols but his habits, his weaknesses, his humanity. They discovered he visited a particular church every Sunday morning, a moment of routine in his otherwise unpredictable schedule. On the chosen Sunday, Freddie entered the church dressed conservatively, a scarf covering her hair, a prayer book in her hands. She looked like any other Dutch woman seeking comfort in faith. She sat 3 rows behind the officer, waiting through the entire service with a pistol pressed against her spine. When the service ended and the congregation filed out, she followed him into the crowded vestibule. In the confusion of people greeting each other, exchanging pleasantries, she stepped close, raised the weapon beneath her coat, and fired twice into his back. The officer collapsed. Freddie dropped the gun and moved with the panicking crowd toward the exit, screaming and crying like everyone else, just another terrified civilian. She disappeared into the chaos before the guards could even identify where the shots had come from. But not every mission succeeded. not every target died. The sisters experienced failures that haunted them differently than the successes. There was an operation where the target noticed Truus's hand moving toward her concealed weapon and ran, shouting for guards, forcing her to flee without completing the kill. Another time, Freddie's pistol jammed at the critical moment, the target escaping while she frantically tried to clear the mechanism. These failures meant increased danger for everyone. Failed targets reported the attempts, security tightened, and the resistance lost opportunities. Worse, some failures led to captures of other resistance members. A botched assassination in Amsterdam resulted in the Gestapo arresting an entire safehouse network, 17 people tortured and executed. The guilt was crushing. The sisters knew intellectually that they couldn't succeed every time, that the work itself was nearly impossible, but emotionally they carried every failure as a personal betrayal of those who depended on them. The resistance leadership began rotating the sisters to different cities, spreading their work across the country, to avoid establishing patterns the Nazis could predict. They operated in Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Utrecht, always moving, never staying long enough to become familiar faces. Each new city meant new contacts, new safehouses, new targets. The constant movement was exhausting but necessary. In Utrecht, they eliminated a Dutch police chief who had personally arrested over 200 resistance members. In Rotterdam, they sabotaged a weapons depot, causing an explosion that destroyed supplies intended for the Eastern Front. In Amsterdam, they rescued a group of Jewish children literally from the steps of a train bound for Westerbork transit camp, a daring daylight operation that could have ended in their immediate execution. The missions blurred together, an endless cycle of planning, execution, escape and recovery before the next assignment arrived. What kept them alive was discipline and luck in equal measure. The discipline came from training, from experience, from watching other resistance members die because of careless mistakes. Never use the same route twice, never meet in the same location, never trust someone you haven't personally vetted. Change your appearance frequently. Memorize cover stories until they feel like truth. Keep weapons cleaned and loaded. Always have an escape plan and a backup plan for the backup plan. But discipline could only do so much. Luck was the variable they couldn't control. Luck was the checkpoint guard who waved them through without searching the cart full of hidden explosives. Luck was the Gestapo raid that happened an hour after they left a safe house. Luck was the collaborator who didn't recognize Freddie's face from a wanted poster. The sisters knew their luck wouldn't last forever. Every resistance fighter understood they were living on borrowed time. The question wasn't if they would be caught or killed, but when, and what they could accomplish before that moment arrived. The winter of 1944 brought a new horror to the Netherlands, the Hunger Winter. The Dutch government in exile had called for a railway strike to hinder German military movements, and the Nazis retaliated by blocking food deliveries to the Western Netherlands. Starvation became a weapon of war. Rations dropped to under 400 calories per day. People ate tulip bulbs, sugar beets, anything remotely edible. Bodies appeared on streets, dead from hunger and cold. Children's growth stunted. Adults became skeletal. Over 20,000 Dutch civilians would die before liberation came. The Oversteegen sisters continued their resistance work while their own bodies weakened from malnutrition. They transported weapons and intelligence on bicycles with no tire rubber, just metal rims on wooden wheels. The sound announcing their presence, but the alternative was not moving at all. They executed missions on empty stomachs, hands shaking, not just from fear, but from hunger. The Nazi targets they killed were often the only people in the Netherlands with access to adequate food, stolen from Dutch warehouses, requisitioned from farms, hoarded while civilians starved. Each assassination felt more justified than the last. During this period, their partnership with Hannie Schaft intensified. Hannie, with her distinctive red hair that she often dyed black, had become one of the most wanted resistance fighters in the Netherlands. The three young women formed a lethal team, covering each other's operations, sharing intelligence, executing coordinated strikes that the Nazis couldn't predict or prevent. Hannie specialized in shooting from motorcycles or bicycles, striking targets in motion and disappearing into traffic. The Oversteegen sisters preferred the close work, the seduction and execution method that had proven so effective. Together, they terrorized the occupation forces. German officers began refusing to walk alone. Collaborators moved with bodyguards. The Gestapo increased rewards for information, eventually offering 10,000 guilders for the capture of the girl with red hair and her associates. But the Dutch people, even those suffering unbearably, refused to betray them. The silence was a form of resistance itself, a collective decision that these young women fighting for liberation deserved protection, even at the risk of brutal reprisals. The missions during the Hunger Winter carried additional weight. Every successful sabotage of German supply lines meant more food might eventually reach Dutch civilians. Every eliminated officer was one less person coordinating deportations or executions. The stakes had always been life and death, but now the sisters could see the cost of occupation literally dying in the streets around them. Children begging for scraps, elderly couples too weak to leave their beds, families burning furniture for warmth because there was no coal. The suffering hardened something in Truus and Freddy, transformed their anger into something colder and more focused. They stopped seeing their targets as human beings at all. They became problems to solve, obstacles to remove, threats to eliminate. This psychological distance was necessary for survival, but it came at a cost they wouldn't calculate until decades later, when the nightmares refused to stop and the guilt became a constant companion. Liberation seemed impossibly distant. The Allies had landed at Normandy in June of 1944, but their advance stalled. The failed Operation Market Garden in September had crushed hopes of quick liberation for the Netherlands. The country remained under Nazi control as winter deepened, and the death toll from starvation climbed. The sisters continued working, continued killing, continued the impossible task of resisting an empire that still controlled most of Europe. There were moments when the exhaustion felt insurmountable, when the hunger and fear and endless violence seemed like they would never end, when death almost seemed preferable to another day of this existence. But they had made a commitment. They had promised to fight until the Netherlands was free or they were dead, and the Oversteegen sisters kept their promises. They had become something beyond normal human endurance, fueled by rage and purpose and a stubborn refusal to surrender to evil. Then came April of 1945, and everything changed. The Allies finally pushed into the Netherlands. Canadian forces advanced from the east, liberating city after city. The Nazis, facing inevitable defeat, became even more brutal. They executed resistance members by the dozens in final acts of vengeance. The Gestapo worked overtime, trying to capture as many fighters as possible before retreat. This was the most dangerous time. The sisters knew the Nazis had lists, names, descriptions. Hannie Schaft was captured on April 17th, just weeks before liberation, executed by the SS on the dunes near Bloemendaal. Her murder devastated Truus and Freddy, their friend, their partner in countless operations, killed so close to freedom. The sisters went into hiding for the final weeks, avoiding the desperate Nazi purges, waiting for the liberation they had fought 5 years to achieve. On May 5th, 1945, the Germans officially surrendered. The Netherlands was free. The liberation brought joy and chaos in equal measure. Canadian soldiers rolled into Haarlem on armored vehicles decorated with flowers, crowds screaming and crying and embracing their liberators. Dutch flags emerged from hiding places where they had been concealed for 5 years. People danced in streets, still marked by bullet holes and bomb damage. The Oversteegen sisters stood among the celebrating crowds, watching the city transform back into something resembling normal life. But they felt disconnected, separate, like ghosts observing a world they no longer belonged to. Everyone around them was celebrating freedom, but Truus and Freddy carried a weight that wouldn't lift with the Nazi retreat. They had killed people. They didn't know exactly how many. Dozens, certainly. Perhaps more. They had looked into the eyes of men and pulled triggers, watched bodies fall, caused death with their own hands. The celebration felt surreal, like it was happening to someone else, to people who hadn't spent their teenage years becoming expert assassins. The resistance members who survived began sharing their stories, comparing experiences, processing the trauma of occupation. But the Oversteegen sisters remained silent about the specifics of their work. When asked what they had done during the war, they spoke vaguely about helping the resistance or working against the Nazis. They never mentioned the assassinations, never spoke about the seduction methods, the close-range executions, the bodies in forests and alleyways. This silence became a pattern that would last the rest of their lives. Part of it was protection. Even after liberation, some collaborators remained in the Netherlands, and loose talk about specific operations could lead to retribution. Part of it was shame. Not shame about fighting the Nazis, but shame about what they had been forced to become, the pieces of their humanity they had sacrificed. And part of it was something darker, the fear that if they started talking about the killings, they wouldn't be able to stop, that the floodgates would open, and decades of suppressed trauma would consume them completely. The Dutch government began the process of recognizing resistance fighters, awarding medals and commendations. The Oversteegen sisters received official recognition for their contributions, but the citations were deliberately vague, mentioning courier work and sabotage operations without specifics. The true nature of their work remained classified, buried in files that wouldn't be opened for decades. This suited the sisters perfectly. They didn't want recognition. They didn't want to be known as the teenage assassins of Haarlem. They wanted to disappear back into normal life, to become ordinary women again, to pretend that the war years had never happened, but normal life proved impossible. How do you return to being a regular person after spending your formative years killing people? How do you build relationships when you can't talk about the most significant experiences of your life? How do you sleep when closing your eyes brings back faces of men you killed? Truus married and had children, trying desperately to build the conventional life that the war had stolen from her. She worked ordinary jobs, raised her family, participated in community activities. To her neighbors, she was just another Dutch woman rebuilding her life after the occupation. Nobody knew what she had done. Nobody suspected that the friendly mother next door had been one of the deadliest resistance fighters in the Netherlands. Freddie followed a similar path, marrying, working, trying to construct a normal existence. But both sisters struggled with what today would be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. They experienced nightmares, flashbacks, panic attacks. Loud noises sent them into fight-or-flight responses. They couldn't stand having people behind them. They constantly scanned rooms for exits. The hypervigilance that had kept them alive during the war never shut off. The sisters rarely discussed the war, even with each other. It was too painful, too complicated, too heavy to carry in conversation. They had lived through something that nobody else could understand unless they had been there, done those things, made those choices. The killing especially remained unspoken. They had been trained to seduce and execute, to use their youth and femininity as weapons, to become exactly what the Nazis never expected. That work had saved lives, had contributed to liberation, had been absolutely necessary, but it had also damaged them in ways that no medal or commendation could address. The psychological cost of their service would echo through decades, affecting their relationships, their mental health, their ability to find peace. They had won the war but lost something essential in the process, something they would spend the rest of their lives trying to recover. For decades, the story of the Oversteegen sisters remained hidden in the shadows of history. While male resistance leaders wrote memoirs and gave interviews, while certain operations became legendary and were taught in schools, Truus and Freddie stayed silent. The Netherlands celebrated its resistance heroes, erected monuments, held annual commemorations. But the specific story of two teenage girls who had killed Nazis with cold precision was deemed too controversial, too uncomfortable for the sanitized version of resistance history that the country wanted to remember. The official narrative preferred stories of sabotage and intelligence gathering, of brave men blowing up bridges and rescuing airmen. The story of young women using seduction and assassination was too complicated, too morally ambiguous, too challenging for a nation trying to heal and move forward. So the sisters remained footnotes, their contributions acknowledged but never examined, their names mentioned but their actions never detailed. The silence took its toll. Truus struggled with depression throughout her adult life, experiencing periods of such darkness that she could barely function. The faces of the men she had killed visited her in dreams, in quiet moments, in unexpected flashes of memory that left her shaking and disoriented. She had nightmares about specific operations, about moments when things went wrong, about the texture of pulling a trigger and feeling the recoil and knowing that another human being had just died by her hand. Her family knew she had been in the resistance, but they didn't understand the depth of her trauma. How could they? She couldn't tell them what she had actually done. Freddie experienced similar struggles, developing anxiety disorders that made normal social interactions exhausting. She startled at sudden movements, felt panic in crowds, experienced flashbacks triggered by sounds or smells that connected to wartime memories. Both sisters sought therapy sporadically, but in post-war Netherlands, psychological treatment for trauma was primitive at best. The concept of PTSD wouldn't even be formally recognized until the 1980s, decades after they needed help. As the years passed and the war generation began aging, historians started pressing for more detailed accounts of resistance operations. Archives opened, classified files became available, and researchers discovered references to operations that had never been fully documented. The Oversteegen sisters' names appeared in intelligence reports, in coded communications, in debriefing documents from Allied officers who had worked with the Dutch resistance. Slowly, scholars began piecing together the truth about what these women had actually accomplished. But when journalists approached Truus and Freddie for interviews, the sisters remained evasive. They would confirm basic facts, acknowledge their participation in resistance activities, but they refused to discuss specifics. They never answered the question that everyone wanted to know. How many Nazis did you kill? The number remained locked inside them, a secret they protected fiercely. In 2014, a Dutch filmmaker named Thijs Zeeman finally convinced Truus, then 91 years old, to participate in a documentary. For the first time in nearly 70 years, she spoke publicly about some of her wartime activities. She described the training, the fear, the constant danger. She mentioned the assassination operations, though still without graphic detail. But when Zeeman asked her directly about the number of people she had killed, Truus's face hardened. She looked directly at the camera and said something that would become the most quoted line from the documentary. "I never counted. If you start counting, you start remembering each one, and that's a road to madness." It was an admission and a refusal simultaneously. She acknowledged the killings but rejected the idea of quantifying them, of reducing human deaths to a statistic. The number would die with her. Freddie, interviewed separately, gave nearly identical responses. She confirmed participating in assassinations, but refused to specify numbers or details. She spoke about the necessity of their actions, about the context of occupation and genocide, about the impossible choices resistance fighters faced. But she also spoke about the cost, about waking up screaming decades after the war ended, about the relationships she couldn't maintain because she couldn't share her true self with anyone, about the pieces of her soul that had been left in Dutch forests and alleyways, sacrificed in a war that had demanded everything from her. The documentaries and subsequent books brought renewed attention to the sisters' story. Suddenly, in their 90s, they became celebrated heroes. The Dutch government issued formal recognition. Monuments included their names. Schools invited them to speak. But Truus and Freddie approached this late recognition with ambivalence. They appreciated that their contributions were finally acknowledged, but they remained uncomfortable with being portrayed as heroes. They had done what needed to be done, nothing more, and they had paid a price that no honor could repay. The question of the body count haunted researchers and historians who studied the sisters' operations. Intelligence documents from the war years referenced multiple successful eliminations, coded reports mentioning targets neutralized, Nazi officers who disappeared under suspicious circumstances in areas where the sisters had been operating. British intelligence files declassified in the early 2000s contained references to Dutch resistance cells responsible for dozens of confirmed Nazi casualties, with the Oversteegen sisters specifically named as operatives in several high-value eliminations. But the documents never provided exact numbers. The resistance had been deliberately vague in their record-keeping, protecting operatives by keeping details fragmentary and scattered across multiple networks. Estimates from historians ranged wildly. Some suggested the sisters might have killed as few as 10 people. Others, analyzing the frequency of their missions and the duration of their service, suggested the number could be closer to 40 or 50. But these were educated guesses, extrapolations from incomplete data. The truth remained locked in the memories of two women who refused to unlock it. What made the sisters' silence even more significant was the contrast with other resistance fighters who did discuss their wartime actions. Male operatives wrote detailed memoirs, gave interviews describing specific operations, even boasted about their kills in some cases. But women resistance fighters, particularly those who had used seduction as a tactic, faced different pressures. There was a stigma attached to women who had used their sexuality as a weapon, even when deployed against enemy combatants. Dutch society in the post-war decades wasn't ready to celebrate teenage girls who had flirted with Nazis before shooting them. The cultural discomfort with their methods contributed to the erasure of their story. It was easier to focus on male resistance fighters who had engaged in more conventional warfare, who hadn't challenged traditional gender roles even while fighting occupation. The Oversteegen sisters understood this dynamic instinctively, which reinforced their decision to remain silent about the specifics of their work. Their friend Hannie Schaft became more famous precisely because she had been martyred before she could complicate the narrative with her own testimony. Dead heroes are easier to celebrate than living ones with trauma and moral complexity. Hannie was immortalized as the girl with red hair, a symbol of Dutch resistance whose actual operations could be romanticized without her objecting or providing uncomfortable details. Monuments to Hannie appeared throughout the Netherlands, but Truus and Freddy, who had survived, who carried the weight of their actions into old age, who couldn't be simplified into symbols, remained controversial figures even as they gained recognition. Their survival meant they could tell stories that challenged the clean narrative of resistance heroism. They could talk about the psychological damage, the moral ambiguity, the ways that necessary violence still destroys those who commit it. This made their story less palatable, but infinitely more honest. In 2016, Truus Oversteegen died at age 92. Freddy had passed away in 2004 at 78. With their deaths, the exact number of their kills became impossible to verify. Whatever secrets they had carried, whatever specific memories haunted their private moments, died with them. Their children and grandchildren were left with fragments of stories, implications, and suggestions, but never the full truth. The sisters had made a deliberate choice to protect their families from that knowledge, believing that some burdens shouldn't be inherited. They had lived with the weight of their actions for over 70 years, experiencing the nightmares and the guilt and the flashbacks alone, refusing to transfer that trauma to the next generation. It was perhaps their final act of protection, shielding their loved ones from the full horror of what the war had demanded from them. The historical community was left to piece together their story from external sources. Nazi reports of officer deaths, resistance communication logs, testimony from other operatives who had worked alongside them, intelligence assessments from Allied forces. These sources confirmed that the Oversteegen sisters had been extraordinarily effective resistance fighters, responsible for multiple high-value eliminations and countless sabotage operations. They confirmed that the sisters had operated continuously from 1941 through 1945, an unusually long period of active service that most resistance fighters didn't survive. They confirmed that the sisters had been among the most dangerous operatives the Dutch resistance produced. But the sources couldn't answer the one question everyone wanted answered. Exactly how many Nazi officers and collaborators had died at the hands of two teenage girls who decided that evil required a violent response? That number, whatever it was, had been taken to two graves in Dutch cemeteries, buried under headstones that identified the women resting beneath simply as mothers and grandmothers, with no mention of the war, no reference to resistance. Tant service, nothing to indicate the extraordinary and terrible things they had done before they turned 20 years old. The legacy of the Oversteegen sisters extends far beyond the body count they refused to reveal. Their story challenges fundamental assumptions about who becomes a soldier, who commits violence in war, and who gets remembered in history. For decades, resistance narratives centered on men because historians and society expected men to be warriors. Women were relegated to support roles in the official histories: nurses, couriers, intelligence gatherers. These were important functions, but they weren't the complete story. The Oversteegen sisters proved that women could be just as lethal, just as strategic, just as committed to violent resistance as any male operative. Their effectiveness came precisely from subverting expectations, from weaponizing the assumptions that made them invisible to their enemies. The Nazis never developed adequate countermeasures against female operatives because they fundamentally couldn't imagine women as serious military threats. This blind spot cost them dearly, not just in the Netherlands, but across occupied Europe, where similar networks of women resistance fighters operated. The psychological dimension of their story raises uncomfortable questions about what society asks of its defenders and what responsibility it bears for the consequences. Truus and Freddy were children when they began killing, 14 and 16 years old. In any other context, asking teenagers to commit premeditated murder would be considered monstrous child abuse. But the context of Nazi occupation created impossible moral calculations. The sisters' actions saved lives. Their assassinations removed people actively participating in genocide and oppression. The utilitarian argument is clear: their kills prevented greater suffering. But that moral clarity doesn't erase the psychological damage they sustained. The nightmares, the depression, the inability to form normal relationships, the decades of untreated PTSD. Who bears responsibility for that suffering? The Nazis, certainly, for creating the circumstances that made such violence necessary, but also the resistance leadership who recruited children and the post-war society that failed to provide adequate psychological support for traumatized fighters, and the culture of silence that prevented them from processing their experiences openly. Modern psychologists who have studied trauma in child soldiers recognize patterns that align eerily with what the Oversteegen sisters experienced. The emotional numbing necessary to function as an assassin, the hypervigilance that never shuts off, the difficulty reintegrating into civilian life, the substance abuse and depression common among those who kill during adolescence. The sisters displayed many of these symptoms, but received minimal support because the framework for understanding combat trauma in women, let alone child combatants, didn't exist in post-war Netherlands. They were expected to simply move on, to be grateful for liberation, to rebuild normal lives as if the war years had been a temporary interruption rather than a formative trauma that fundamentally altered their psychological development. The expectation was unrealistic and ultimately cruel, but it was the standard approach to trauma across the post-war Western world. Their refusal to quantify their kills represents more than just personal privacy. It's a rejection of the way society commodifies violence, reducing the complex moral weight of taking human life to a simple statistic. In military culture, kill counts are often treated as measures of effectiveness, even sources of pride. But the Oversteegen sisters refused to participate in that framework. By declining to provide a number, they insisted that each death carried individual moral weight, that killing couldn't be reduced to scorekeeping. This stance demonstrated a moral sophistication that many professional soldiers never achieve. They understood that necessary violence is still violence, that justified killing still requires grief and acknowledgement, that even Nazi officers were human beings whose deaths should be mourned even as their elimination was celebrated. This nuanced position made their story difficult to incorporate into simple narratives of heroism. The archives that remain paint a picture of extraordinary effectiveness. Operations they participated in resulted in the deaths of at least 12 confirmed high-value targets, including Gestapo officers, SS commanders, and collaborators responsible for hundreds of Dutch deaths. But these are only the missions where documentation survived and their involvement was explicitly recorded. Intelligence analysts who have studied resistance operations in Haarlem and surrounding areas during the war years have identified at least 20 additional Nazi officer deaths that match the operational patterns the sisters employed. Unexplained shootings in isolated locations, officers found dead after being seen with young women, assassinations executed with small-caliber pistols at close range. The circumstantial evidence suggests their actual impact was significantly larger than official records indicate. But without confirmation from the operatives themselves, these remain educated guesses rather than documented history. The true scope of their war against the occupation died with them, preserved only in the nightmares they could never escape. Today, the story of the Oversteegen sisters is finally receiving the recognition it deserves. But that recognition comes too late for the women who lived it. Truus and Freddie spent most of their lives in obscurity, their contributions minimized or ignored, their trauma unacknowledged. Only in their final years did Dutch society begin grappling with the full complexity of what these women had accomplished and what it had cost them. Schools now teach their story as part of resistance history curriculum. Monuments in Haarlem commemorate their service. Academic papers analyze their operations and their psychological resilience. But this late recognition can't undo the decades of silence, can't heal the wounds that festered untreated for 70 years, can't restore the pieces of themselves they sacrificed in forests and alleyways across occupied Netherlands. The recognition honors their memory, but also highlights how thoroughly society failed them when they actually needed support. Their story forces confrontation with an uncomfortable truth. Liberation requires people willing to commit violence, and those people pay prices that victory parades and medals cannot address. The Oversteegen sisters were heroes by any reasonable definition. They risked everything to fight genuine evil. They saved lives through their actions. They contributed meaningfully to the defeat of one of history's most monstrous regimes. But heroism and trauma coexist. The same actions that make someone a hero can simultaneously destroy them psychologically. Society wants simple narratives where heroes emerge from war unscathed, where violence against evil carries no moral or psychological cost. The sisters' story rejects that simplicity. It insists that we acknowledge the full human cost of resistance, including the internal damage sustained by those brave enough to fight. This acknowledgement doesn't diminish their heroism. It honors it more fully by recognizing the true sacrifice they made. The question of how many Nazis they killed will never be definitively answered. Estimates range from a dozen to over 50, but the exact number remains unknowable. Perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps reducing their service to a body count misses the point entirely. The number matters less than what it represents. Years of continuous danger, countless moments of terror, the weight of premeditated killing carried from adolescence through old age. Whether they killed 12 people or 50, the psychological impact was devastating. Whether the number was small or large, each death required the same cold calculation, the same suppression of human empathy, the same violation of the social conditioning that tells us killing is wrong. The sisters understood that revealing the number would invite judgment about whether it was enough, whether it justified their trauma, whether their suffering was proportional to their impact. By keeping the number private, they refused to let others quantify and judge their service. What the Oversteegen sisters proved is that ordinary people, even children, are capable of extraordinary resistance when confronted with absolute evil. They weren't special forces soldiers or trained assassins. They were working-class Dutch girls who loved their country and couldn't stand by while it was destroyed. The skills they developed, the violence they committed, the psychological damage they sustained all emerged from circumstances that should never have existed. They became killers because the alternative was accepting genocide and oppression. Their story is not a celebration of violence, but a testimony to what evil forces ordinary people to become in order to defeat it. Every assassination they conducted, every Nazi officer they eliminated, every mission they survived, came at a cost measured not in bullets expended, but in pieces of soul sacrificed. And they paid that cost willingly, knowing it would haunt them forever, because some things are worth more than personal peace. The final legacy of Truus and Freddie Oversteegen is not the number of enemies they killed, but the example they set for understanding resistance in all its complexity. Their story teaches that heroism is complicated, that necessary violence still scars, that gender is irrelevant when it comes to courage and commitment, and that societies owe debts to their defenders that can never be fully repaid. It teaches that the people who do the hardest and darkest work to preserve freedom often carry the heaviest burdens in silence. It teaches that some questions, like the exact body count of teenage resistance fighters, matter less than the broader truth they illuminate about the cost of fighting evil. The Oversteegen sisters were extraordinary, not because they were superhuman, but because they were terrifyingly human, capable of both killing and being destroyed by that killing, brave enough to do what was necessary and honest enough never to pretend it didn't damage them. They took their secrets to their graves, but they left behind a story that demands we remember not just the victory they helped achieve, but the price they paid for it. That price, whatever the exact number of deaths involved, was everything.